It's funny how a life can pivot on a single, carelessly spoken phrase. Not a shout, not a declaration of war, but a whisper of dismissal. For 30 years, I had been the silent partner in Richard's meteoric rise. My name was Eleanor, but to the world, and increasingly to myself, I was simply Mrs. Richard Sterling, the supportive wife, the gracious hostess, the invisible force that kept his world perfectly calibrated so he could conquer it. Our story began like many others. A college romance built on shared dreams and late-night conversations fueled by cheap coffee. I was studying architecture and I was in love with it. My sketchbooks were filled with designs for community centers, sustainable homes, and public libraries. I wasn't just drawing buildings, I was imagining the lives that would unfold within them. The echo of children's laughter in a library atrium, the quiet contemplation in a sunlit reading nook, the sense of belonging in a well-designed public space. That was my passion. Creating spaces that nurtured humanity. He was in business, with a hunger in his eyes that I mistook for a shared ambition for us, not just for him. When his career began to take off with the launch of his first small firm, it seemed natural that I would take a step back. Just for a little while, we'd said, his hand covering mine over a pile of my blueprints, until we're established. But a little while is a deceptive thief of time. It became a year, then 5, then a decade. My blueprints and drafting tools were packed away in the attic, their sharp, precise lines replaced by the fluid, adaptable demands of catering lists and social calendars. I traded the solid certainty of concrete and steel for the fragile art of managing egos and expectations at dinner parties. I never saw it as a sacrifice, not in the beginning. I saw it as a strategic reallocation of my skills. I was building our life, our legacy. I was the one who turned our empty houses into homes, creating sanctuaries of impeccable taste and comfort that he could return to after a brutal day in the corporate trenches. I was the one who hosted flawless fundraisers and client dinners, not just remembering a favorite wine, but understanding the intricate politics of the seating chart. I once spent an entire evening talking about 18th century French poetry with the wife of a potential investor, a woman everyone else had dismissed as cold and unapproachable. The next day, Richard closed his biggest deal to date. He called it a stroke of genius. My genius went unmentioned. I proofread his reports at 2 a.m., my architect's eye for detail catching the small structural flaws in his arguments. I managed our growing portfolio of investments, quietly multiplying our wealth while he focused on the glory of the hunt. I raised our 2 wonderful children, shielding them from his moods and absences, ensuring they grew into kind, independent adults. I did it all with a quiet pride because I believed we were a team. He was the face of Sterling Investments, but I was its silent foundational partner. For a long time, that was enough. But slowly, a subtle erosion began. It wasn't in grand, dramatic moments, but in the small, everyday dismissals. It was in the way he'd say, "You wouldn't understand, Ellie. It's a business thing," when I'd ask about his day, patting my hand as if I were a curious child. It was in the way he'd introduce me at functions, his hand on my back, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like ownership. "This is my wife, Eleanor." The emphasis was always on the "my," as if I were his finest acquisition, a beautifully maintained property. His company, a high-powered investment firm, was his kingdom. And in that kingdom, he was the undisputed king. He and his team worked out of the prestigious Blackwood Building, a 40-story monolith of glass and steel that dominated the city skyline. Richard loved that building. To him, it was a symbol of power, of permanence. I knew this because I was the one who helped him pick out his corner office furniture, ensuring the feng shui was just right to promote success. I was the one who sent lavish gift baskets to the building management every Christmas. Sometimes I would stand across the street and just look at it. My old dreams of designing buildings would surface, a bittersweet pang of what might have been. I was intimately involved in the soul of his success, yet I was entirely separate from its public acknowledgement, an outsider with an insider's key. The feeling of invisibility had been growing for years, a dull ache in my chest that I would push down with another task, another party to plan, another way to be useful. I told myself that he was under a lot of pressure, that his work was demanding. I made excuses because the alternative was too painful to confront. The woman I was, the architect who dreamed of shaping skylines, had been slowly sanded away, leaving behind only a title. His wife. I was standing on the precipice of a great change. I just didn't know it yet. All it would take was one final gentle push. The push came on a Tuesday. It was the company's annual charity gala, the glittering pinnacle of Richard's corporate calendar, and an event I had orchestrated from the ground up. For 3 months, my life had been a whirlwind of logistics. I had chosen the theme, City of Stars, a subtle nod to the skyline they all sought to conquer, and personally vetted every detail. I negotiated with the hotel. I debated the merits of sea bass versus filet mignon with the caterer. I spent an afternoon in a cooled warehouse selecting the precise shade of midnight blue roses for the centerpieces. I even designed the lighting scheme myself, ensuring the grand ballroom was bathed in a soft, flattering glow that made everyone look like a movie star. My role was to be the seamless, invisible engine behind the evening's success. As always, I was wearing a deep sapphire gown, a column of silk that was elegant and deliberately understated. Richard had glanced at me as we were leaving the house, his eyes scanning me with the same appraising look he gave a stock ticker. "You look good, Ellie." Very appropriate. Appropriate. That was the highest compliment I could hope for these days. It meant I blended in perfectly, a tasteful part of the scenery. In the grand ballroom, a space I now knew as intimately as my own living room, I moved through the crowd with practiced grace. The air buzzed with the energy of power and money. I smiled, I laughed in all the right places. I inquired about children and summer homes, tucking away little details for future use. I was a diplomat in a designer dress, smoothing the social path upon which Richard would stride. He was holding court near the grand ice sculpture, a miniature, shimmering replica of the Blackwood Building, of course. He was surrounded by his top lieutenants, a pack of young, hungry sharks in tailored suits, all of them laughing a little too loudly at his jokes. I saw him beckon over a new analyst, a bright-eyed kid named Peterson who looked barely old enough to shave. I was gliding by on my way to ensure the orchestra was cued for the guest speaker, when Richard's voice, thick with self-importance, snagged me. "And of course," he was saying, puffing out his chest, "the key is to have a support system that understands its role. You can't have distractions. Home life has to be a well-oiled machine." Peterson, eager to impress, looked over at me as I approached. He gave me a polite, genuinely warm smile. "Mrs. Sterling, the event is absolutely incredible. The flow is perfect, and the lighting design is breathtaking. It makes the whole room feel aspirational. Is this what you do professionally? Event architecture, perhaps?" The question landed like a drop of rain in a desert. Event architecture. He saw the design, the structure, the intention behind it all. For a fleeting second, a spark of my old self, the girl with the sketchbook, flickered to life. I opened my mouth, a genuine smile forming. I almost said, "I was trained as an architect, actually." I almost told him about the state prize I'd won for my community center design. But before I could form the words, Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was a sound that sliced through the warm ballroom air like a shard of ice. He draped his arm over my shoulders, a heavy proprietary weight that pinned me to my place. "Her," he said, turning his gaze back to his adoring audience of sycophants. He didn't even look at me. "Oh, she doesn't do anything." He paused for effect, letting the silence hang. "She's just my wife. Just." The word hung in the air, shimmering with a unique and potent cruelty. It was a pinprick to the heart, small and sharp and devastatingly precise. The ambient noise of the gala, the clinking glasses, the murmur of 100 conversations, the string quartet playing a gentle Vivaldi piece I had specifically chosen, all of it faded into a dull, distant roar. In that moment, the entire 30-year edifice of our marriage revealed itself for what it was. A structure built on a faulty foundation, a grand design with a fatal flaw. I was not a partner. I was not a pillar. I was an ornament, a beautifully maintained, appropriate accessory to his life. Just his wife. The sharks around him chuckled, a low, predatory sound. One of them, a vice president named Marcus, smirked and looked me up and down. Peterson, the young analyst, had the decency to blush, his eyes darting to his shoes. He knew, even if Richard didn't, that a line had been crossed. Richard himself was blissfully, arrogantly oblivious. He had already moved on, launching into an anecdote about a recent corporate takeover. He squeezed my shoulder, a mindless, automatic gesture of possession, before releasing me. I was dismissed. A strange calm washed over me, the kind that follows a massive explosion. The hurt was there, a white-hot coal in my chest, but it was quickly being encased in something harder, colder. Ice. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't shed a tear. The architect within me, the part of me I thought had been buried under decades of domesticity, suddenly awoke. It looked at the situation with a cold, clear, analytical eye. The problem had been identified. The existing structure was unsound. It needed to be demolished. A new one had to be built, on my own terms. I gave Richard a small, tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Excuse me," I murmured, my voice even. "I need to check on the dessert course." As I walked away, my steps were steady, my back ramrod straight. The sapphire dress suddenly felt like armor. The beautiful ballroom I had created now looked garish and fake. The midnight blue roses seemed to wilt before my eyes. I didn't go to the kitchen. I walked past the ballroom, my heels clicking a defiant rhythm on the marble floor of the lobby. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the rain-slicked street. The cool night air was a balm, clearing the suffocating perfume of the party from my lungs. I hailed a cab, the city lights blurring through the water-streaked window into abstract streaks of possibility. And in the quiet solitude of that ride, a new blueprint began to form in my mind, sharp and precise. He loved the Blackwood building. He saw it as the ultimate symbol of his power. He was about to find out what it truly meant to be a master of the universe. The foundation of his world was about to shift, and he wouldn't even feel the tremor until the whole thing came down around him. The morning after the gala, our kitchen was filled with a brilliant, unforgiving sunlight. Richard sat at the marble island, nursing a hangover with a strong black coffee. He was groaning about a headache and complaining about Marcus, his vice president, who had tried to poach a client after a few too many cocktails. He was completely, blissfully unaware that his entire world had fractured. He looked at me, squinting. "You're quiet this morning, Ellie." "Just thinking," I said, my voice smooth as cream. I placed a plate of toast in front of him. "About the fundraiser and the guest list." "Ah, good," he grunted, taking a large bite. "Always planning ahead. That's my girl. My girl." The words, once a term of endearment, now sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I smiled faintly and went about my morning. But inside, the architect was wide awake. The demolition phase was over. It was time for site preparation and design. My first move was to retreat to the one room in the house that had been exclusively mine, and consequently had been ignored for decades. My old study. It was at the top of the house, a dusty, forgotten space with a slanted ceiling and a single dormer window. Under a thick canvas drop cloth was my old drafting table. I pulled the cover off, sending a cloud of dust motes dancing in the morning light. The wood was still solid, the mechanics still perfectly balanced. My T-squares, my French curves, my specialized pencils, they were all there, lying dormant. For years, this room had been a mausoleum of my former self. Now, it was my war room. I didn't begin by sketching buildings. I began by sketching out our financial empire. For 20 years, Richard had handed me his enormous paychecks and bonuses with a vague instruction to make it grow. And I did. I was the one who read the financial papers, who researched stocks, who diversified our portfolio into real estate, art, and emerging tech. He saw the ever-growing number on the quarterly statements and was satisfied. He never bothered with the details. He just assumed it was another part of the well-oiled machine that was his home life. He had no idea he had funded his own demise. Working from my newly resurrected study, I began the painstaking process of untangling our assets. I created spreadsheets, charts, and diagrams, my old skills for precision and detail finding a new, thrilling purpose. I started liquidating certain long-term holdings, moving funds through a series of carefully constructed blind trusts and shell corporations. I gave them innocuous names: the Bluebell Fund, the Willow Creek Trust. It was a delicate, high-stakes game of financial chess, played in absolute silence. On the outside, I was still Eleanor Sterling, planning a garden party for the local historical society. On the inside, I was laying the financial groundwork for the biggest acquisition of my life. The next step was information. You can't buy a building like the Blackwood without knowing who holds the deed. It wasn't public knowledge. A building that iconic is owned not by a person, but by a ghost, an entity designed to be impenetrable. So I hired my own team. Not a flashy big-name firm that might have connections to Richard, but a small boutique advisory group I found through my art world contacts. They were called Athena Advisory, a discreet firm run by a brilliant woman named Ms. Davies, who specialized in impossible acquisitions. I met her not in a boardroom, but in a quiet corner of the city's art museum. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "My firm values two things above all else: discretion and results. What can we do for you?" "I want to know who owns the Blackwood building," I said, my voice not wavering. "And I want to know if they're willing to sell." She didn't blink. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded. "That can be arranged." 2 weeks later, a simple manila envelope arrived. Inside was a single-page report. The Blackwood building was owned by a foreign holding company called Argent Capital, a consortium of investors who were, according to Athena's intelligence, over-leveraged and quietly seeking to liquidate assets to cover losses elsewhere. They were looking for a silent, all-cash buyer to avoid spooking the market. They were vulnerable. I sat at my drafting table, the report lying next to a half-finished sketch of a public library I had started 30 years ago. I looked at the clean lines of my old dream, and then at the complex, messy reality of my new one. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about creation. It was about taking the symbol of his power, the one he had flaunted in my face, and making it my own. I wasn't just buying a building. I was reclaiming my skyline. I picked up the phone and called Ms. Davies. "My legal and financial teams are in place," I said. "Proceed with the initial offer. And Ms. Davies," I added, a hint of steel in my voice, "there is to be no negotiation on my identity until the final closing. To them, I am simply the Willow Creek Trust." The negotiations, handled entirely by Ms. Davies and her team, took 6 weeks. It was an all-cash offer, staggeringly large, and as Athena Advisory had predicted, the sellers did not hesitate. The closing was a ghost-like transaction, a river of digital money flowing from the Willow Creek Trust to Argent Capital. On a Thursday afternoon, I received a simple, encrypted email from Ms. Davies. It contained a single sentence: "The asset is secured." I sat at my drafting table, the sunlight from the dormer window falling on my hands. For a moment, I did nothing. I just breathed. I was the owner of the Blackwood building. The silent partner now owned the kingdom. The following Monday was Richard's quarterly board meeting. He left the house in a whirlwind of self-importance, knotting his tie while barking into his phone. "Performance is strong, but we need to be aggressive," he was saying. "No complacency." He gave me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek, the gesture so automatic he might as well have been kissing the wall. "Don't wait up, Ellie. It'll be a long one." "I won't," I said. 2 hours later, I was standing in the immaculate marble lobby of the Blackwood building. My building. I wasn't wearing a sapphire gown. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit, my hair pulled back in a sleek professional chignon. I was no longer appropriate. I was formidable. Ms. Davies met me by the elevators, a leather portfolio in her hand. "They're all in the main conference room. 38th floor," she said. "He's mid-presentation." "Perfect," I replied. "You can go first." On the 38th floor, the atmosphere was hushed and reverent. The thick carpets absorbed all sound. Richard was at the head of a massive mahogany table, his voice booming as he pointed to a chart projected on the wall. The members of his board, including his number 2 Marcus, were watching him, rapt. Ms. Davies opened the door without knocking. Every head turned. Richard's face clouded over with annoyance at the interruption. "This is a private meeting," he snapped, his eyes dismissing Ms. Davies as an irrelevant secretary. "My apologies for the intrusion, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through his bluster. "I am Evelyn Davies. I'm here on behalf of my client, the new owners of the Blackwood building." A confused silence fell over the room. Richard stared at her. "New owners? That's impossible. We would have been informed. The sale was conducted privately to avoid market disruption." Ms. Davies continued smoothly. "The transaction was finalized last Thursday. The ownership has changed." Marcus, the VP, leaned forward. Who? Who is the new owner?" Richard was turning a dangerous shade of purple. "What is the name of this company?" he demanded. "My client is a private holding company," Ms. Davies said, "known as the Willow Creek Trust." Just as the name left her lips, I stepped into the doorway, positioning myself in the exact spot where the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows would frame me. "Willow Creek?" Richard sputtered, shaking his head. "I've never heard of them. Who the hell is Willow Creek?" His voice died in his throat. He had seen me. Every person in that room followed his gaze. The collective intake of breath was audible. There was a beat of pure, unadulterated shock. Jaws literally dropped. Pencils were frozen mid-scribble. Marcus looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. And Richard. His face was a slow-motion collapse of arrogance. The blustering anger drained away, replaced by a wave of confusion, which then gave way to a dawning, sickening horror as the impossible truth began to settle in his eyes. He looked at me, then at Ms. Davies, then back at me. His brain was furiously trying to connect two completely separate files. Eleanor, my wife, and the new owner of my building. The files would not merge. Eleanor, he finally whispered, the word a puff of disbelief. What? What are you doing here? Get out! This is a board meeting. I took a slow step into the room. My heels made a soft, decisive click on the polished floor. I let my eyes drift over the shocked faces of the men who had politely chuckled when he'd dismissed me, before finally letting my gaze land on my husband. I gave him a small, calm smile. It's my meeting now, Richard, I said, my voice steady and clear. I own the room. I paused, letting the words sink in, letting them see the new reality taking shape. In fact, I continued, I own the whole building. I turned to the stunned board. Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Eleanor Sterling. Some of you, I believe, have met me at parties. I then turned my attention back to my husband, who looked like he was about to have a stroke. His face was pale, his mouth slightly agape. You, he stammered. But how? You once told me that a good support system should understand its role, I said, the memory of his words at the gala echoing between us. I took that to heart. I found a new role. I looked at him, at the shell of a man who had built his kingdom on my silent labor. The power in the room had shifted so completely it was almost a physical force. It had all flowed from him to me. I turned to Ms. Davies. Please inform Mr. Sterling and his team that we will be in touch next week to discuss the terms of their new lease agreement. For now, I'm just here to inspect the property. Then I looked directly into Richard's eyes. My property. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Richard was humiliated, his authority shattered in front of the very people he sought to impress. The news of who the new owner was, just his wife, ripped through the company and the city's business circles like a wildfire. Our marriage, as I had known it, ended in that conference room. The structure was demolished. But this story isn't about the end of something. It's about the beginning. In the weeks that followed, I didn't just become a landlord, I became a creator again. I walked the halls of the Blackwood building, not as Richard's wife, but as its owner and visionary. My old study, once a dusty relic, is now a bustling architect's office. I've hired a small, brilliant team, and we are redesigning the building's sterile corporate lobby into a vibrant public space, a place with an art gallery, a small library, and comfortable seating, a space that nurtures humanity. I didn't do it for revenge. Revenge is a fleeting, empty victory. I did it for the woman who packed her drafting tools away in a box, believing her dreams were less important. I did it to reclaim the name that was mine long before I took his. Sometimes the world will try to put you in a box and write a label on it. They'll tell you you're just a wife, just a mother, just a helper. But you are the architect of your own life. You are the one who knows the strength of your own foundation. And you are the only one who can decide when it's time to build a new skyline for yourself. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to be reminded of their own power. And remember, never let anyone tell you who you are. Your story is yours to write.